episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor. Welcome everybody again to another episode of our show with another really fascinating guest today, helping to create a better tomorrow on many different fronts. Today we have the honor of being joined by Dr. Thomas Lovejoy, the really innovative conservation biologist who is the founder and president of the nonprofit Amazon Biodiversity Center, the renowned Biological Dynamics of Forest Fragments Project, and who coined the term biologic diversity. He currently serves as a professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at George Mason University, as a senior fellow at the United Nations Foundation in Washington, D.C., and has also served along the way as the World Bank's Chief Biodiversity Advisor, a lead specialist for environment for Latin America and the Caribbean, the first Biodiversity Chair of the H. John Heinz III Center for Science, Economics, and the Environment, president of the Heinz Center, and chair of the Scientific Technical Advisory Panel for the Global Environment Facility, the multi-billion-dollar funding mechanism that was developed for countries to support their obligations under various international environmental conventions. Dr. Lovejoy spanned the political spectrum, serving for Science and Environmental Council under Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administrations. And in the 1980s, he brought international attention to the world's tropical rainforest, in particular the Brazilian Amazon, where he has worked on and off since 1965. He has written and edited multiple books along the way, credited as a founder of the field of climate change biology, and also founded the series Nature, the popular long-term series on public television. In 2001, Dr. Lovejoy was awarded the prestigious Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement. In 2009, one of the BBVA Foundation Frontiers of Knowledge Award in Ecology and Conservation Biology, appointed Conservation Fellow by National Geographic and Explorer at Large, and in 2012, recognized by the Blue Planet Prize. Dr. Lovejoy holds both bachelor's and PhD in biology from Yale University. Dr. Thomas Lovejoy, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the show today.
Well, thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great having you. This is an extremely important topic, needless to say. I would love to just hand you the floor for a couple of minutes just to further introduce yourself. If you could sort of take us back a little bit to the beginning, to your work at the Trevor Zoo some years ago when you first got interested in this entire space. Love to hear that sort of early days and how this all started.
So when I was 14, I ended up going away to school, the Millbrook School, which had a zoo. And I just liked animals. I had no idea about science or any of the rest of this. But the person who started that zoo also taught biology. And I literally said, well, I'll take it the first year and get it over with. But instead, after about 3 weeks, he had flipped my switch. And by the end of that school year, I understood the outline of life on Earth, the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom, what today we would call biological diversity. And I've never been able to get enough of it ever since. So that's how it started. But that teacher and many of my key mentors, as I progressed, all cared about conservation. And so it was not a total accident that I ended up going to work for a then tiny organization called the World Wildlife Fund in 1973. But I did my PhD in the Amazon when nobody ever went there, really. It was 97% intact. And I've been essentially besotted by the Amazon as the largest repository of biological diversity on Earth, at least on land. And so I have spent a lot of my time subsequently both studying it and working to help for its conservation.
And, looking back at your work at the Amazon Biodiversity Center and the Biologic Dynamics Forest Fragmentation Project, we routinely hear this quote that the Brazilian Amazon, are the lungs of this planet. And looking at this model that you've been working on since the late 1970s, where you study the fragmentation of these islands within the Amazon and the way the diversity goes down and the interesting sort of edge effects and the trophic effects within the islands. Yes, it looks a lot like a human body when we think about these things in other areas like cancer or other types of diseases. Yeah, it's a similar process. Can you talk us through a little bit about this whole concept of island biogeography and how you got the concept for creating this project?
So as I came back to the US from living in Brazil for 2 years to finish up my PhD, there was a lot of interest in both the numbers of species, in particular situations in nature, what set the number. And the original work was all around islands. But then people began to raise the question, might those same generalities apply to remnant islands of natural vegetation left in the course of clearing for whatever purpose? And it was pretty clear to me that actually we knew very, very little about the impact of habitat fragmentation. And there was a raging theoretical argument about what was better, one really big area or a bunch of small ones that added up to the same size. And that was an important question, and it could influence conservation policy. But equally important was people really had very little understanding of the impacts of fragmentation, because the impacts don't happen all in an instant. They happen over years and decades. And there I was advancing projects to the board of the World Wildlife Fund US. And I realized that if we really didn't understand habitat fragmentation, generally speaking, we didn't know whether any of those projects would work in the long term. So I figured that we had to actually try and solve that question. And then I had this crazy idea based on my experience in Brazil, that what they called the 50% rule at the time, which basically said any project in the Amazon has to leave 50% of the forest intact, might actually provide an opportunity to create a giant experiment. And usually ideas like that go nowhere. But the NSF bought me an air ticket, expecting me to fail. I went to Manaus, and within an hour, I had the blessing of the head of the National Institute for Amazon Research, and the rest is history. And the impacts are quite dramatic. And so as a single example, a 100-hectare fragment of forest, which is like 250 acres, loses half of the birds of the forest interior, not those up on top in the canopy or at the edge, but the ones that lurk in the gloom of the forest, loses half of those bird species in less than 15 years. So if you think of it a little bit like a radioactive mineral,
Sure.
losing radioactivity and becoming simpler, what you have is a fragment of habitat losing species and becoming simpler over time. So any unthinking conservation plan that didn't take that into account is likely to get some very unfortunate surprises, decades down the line of things that just simply didn't make it.
I was looking through some of your most current publications, and the one that popped out right away to me at the top of the list was one from 2020 in Phytotaxa magazine, or the journal, Puteria cosmane, not pronouncing that correctly. It's new species from Central Amazonia, and I guess it's quite fascinating that while we have 300,000 species of plants on this planet, somewhere in between there, I guess, we're still finding new ones. And when one thinks of the repository that you write about, not just what the Amazon has given us over centuries in terms of chocolate and rubber, but obviously all the pharmaceutical compounds, the ACE inhibitors, everything from aspirin to quinine and so forth on down the line. So I'm not sort of the plant biokingdom. It's fascinating that we're finding out new things that we didn't know about for the last several thousand years. And I'm going back to this topic of bioprospecting because obviously there's good ways and bad ways to do this. But at the end of the day, we see this amazing value that these lungs of the earth have given to society already, and there's a lot more out there that really smart people like you say we have not found yet, but we're destroying it. Any interesting thoughts, concepts with regard to this topic of bioprospecting within what you are learning in terms of the conservation efforts, things we should be doing, things we shouldn't be doing anymore? Talk us through that area, if you would.
So I think it's important to recognize that every living organism, you, me, plants, animals, other animals, actually are part of individual evolutionary lines that go back at least 3.7 billion years. Okay. So that in itself says to me that we shouldn't be ending those. We should be respectful of all of that.
Sure.
But if you then think just a step further, every one of those species represents a series of solutions to a set of biological problems unique to that species. Mm-hmm. And these have been accumulated over the evolutionary time. Some of it have actually been discarded. We won't know what those were. Mm-hmm. And new ones are being invented by species in nature on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. And any one of those has the capacity to totally transform how we think about the life sciences and how they can benefit people. So, we're now still in the pandemic. More and more people are getting vaccinated. So literally hundreds of millions of people are getting vaccinated. So over time, probably billions of people have benefited from vaccination. And that is actually the product of one of those solutions in nature. So back essentially at the beginning of the 1800s, a British MD, research MD, recognized that milkmaids who suffered cowpox, which they got from cows, mm-hmm. seemed to not get smallpox.
Sure.
So he did the classic daring experiment and basically exposed some of the milkmaids to smallpox. And lo and behold, those who had had cowpox were protected. And so that was the origin of the concept of vaccination.
Mhm.
They didn't even know what kind of organism caused it.
Sure.
Viruses were too small to be known at that point, but they gave it a name, vaccinia, which was because it came from a cow, and the Latin for cow was vacca, right?
Yep.
Well, if you think about how transformative that has been to human existence, it's just staggering, right? And that kind of potential is just ubiquitous in nature. And we tend to be totally oblivious to it. And have yet to actually figure a way in which recognizing biological diversity as a great living library for the life sciences could actually, be embraced by society and help people actually think differently about the natural world from which we come.
Absolutely. We used to have a GlaxoSmithKline years ago. We actually had people that went into the rainforest and they went scuba diving and they looked for interesting species, but come more sophisticated forms of chemistry, whatnot, they got rid of it all, but and down go the success rates. So I think nature has a lot more to teach us.
So I once visited the Pfizer research labs.
Mm-hmm.
That's like 25 years ago,
Yep.
when their budget was something like $3 billion a year. And they were still looking at natural samples, but also doing a lot of just random combinatorial chemistry, hoping to come up with something that would be useful. Well, the head of the lab said to me, our hit rate is about the same between this combinatorial random stuff and samples from nature. He said, but I think if you could put an ecological screen on what you got from nature, you could improve your hit rate way beyond what you get from the random approach. And he's completely correct. So my favorite example I trot out is the leaf cutting ants in the New World tropical rainforests, which live in colonies of roughly 1 million ants each. And they're always taking little bits of green leaves down into the ground. And they're using them as mulch for a fungus farm. And they live on fungus.
Okay.
So, long ago, those ants have figured out which leaves not to take down there because they have natural fungicides in them. So all we need to do is figure out which ones the ants leave alone, and presto, the ants will have screened things in advance for us, and we will do a lot better at getting natural fungicides.
We have a lot to learn from nature. That is true. Dr. Lovejoy, in 2019, you drafted a background note. It was called Science of the Synod. It's on the science of impacts and consequences of deforestation and climate change in the Amazon rainforest. It was for the meeting of the Synod of Bishops for the Pan-Amazon region at the Vatican. And, a couple months ago, we actually had Cardinal Michael Czerny on the show at the Dicastery for Integral Human Development. And, one of the things we always talk about is, aside from birds and monkeys and plants and fresh water and everything, we have people that are in the Amazon, and not a few. Talk a little bit about this aspect. I think this is something that is also sort of overlooked in the sense that, we think of biodiversity, fine, that's great, but there are a lot of people that still live there, indigenous peoples, many different types of tribes. Talk a little bit about that angle of your work, if you would, as well.
So there are multiple indigenous peoples in the Amazon. Roughly a quarter of the Amazon is set aside in demarcated indigenous reserves for those people. And there's still some that need that kind of attention. But basically, they've been living in those forests for really, really long periods of time, and have learned a lot about them. And so one of the smart things for a bioprospector to do is to collaborate with those communities to the extent that they're willing to do it, and investigate some of these properties that they have identified through, a proper modern scientific lens. And beyond the indigenous people, there's another group of people in the Amazon that's more mixed blood, which have been there for essentially 1,000 years or more. And they have found very adequate ways to make a living from the forests and from the rivers. So they're pretty smart about what's useful out there. What they would love to have is connection with the rest of the world for education and for health, but they're pretty content with their way of life, and they're pretty good at it too. So they're all people who basically live in the forest and with the forest, and have been watching it day by day as if they were on lockdown, right? For millennia. And you learn a lot that way. And to the extent that we can be respectful of those people, they may be willing to share some of that knowledge with us.
About a year ago, I did an interview with an elder from the Guarani peoples. They're in Ecuador, and it was right after they won this landmark case against one of the oil companies. They got rid of them, so they're not drilling, and they're a part of the Amazon. But I was just wondering, as you were talking about sort of the different things that we can learn beyond prospect. I mean, I know one of the things that was over the last several years has been kind of how do these spiritual ceremonies and so forth that a lot of Americans and people from other places are coming down to do ayahuasca and then all sorts of spiritual ceremonies. Has that helped at all? Has that sort of moved the needle on sort of the economic benefits to some of these people, those types of programs, or is it better, hey, stay out and more of leave them alone, but create more of an export centric type?
Yeah, so I think that some of the more casual tourism is not necessarily a very helpful thing.
Okay.
But it's perfectly possible to have really respectful tourism. So, and I've seen those kinds of things, and they work pretty well. And the people who've done that go away with a really different sense of the importance of nature in our daily existence. So they will have learned a really big lesson.
Mhm. When one looks at the size of the territory that you are focused on, and I have a number, I don't know if this is on the mark or a little off. I Googled the other day, 2.124 million square miles, about the size of Australia. Obviously, this is not, you can't walk out of the Amazon Biodiversity Center and decide what to do in sort of the immediate environment. You have a much larger purview. What are some of the tools? I mean, obviously, satellites have been extremely useful in watching this progression over the decades. What are some of the other tools, technologies that you either are using or you have on your wish list if trillions of dollars fell from the sky to further help either in the monitoring or, and we'll get into this topic, sort of the reforestation, forest regeneration component of all of this?
Well, first of all, to help your listeners get a sense of scale, the Amazon is roughly the size of the 48 contiguous United States.
Yep.
It's really big. And when you look at it on a map, it doesn't appear to be that substantial because anything close to the equator is not magnified the way things closer to the poles are. But anyway, it's really big. So that's point number one. An incredibly important second point is that what makes the Amazon actually work as this incredible extent of tropical rainforests is a weather system which moves from the Atlantic to the Andes.
Mm-hmm.
And after a rainfall, a lot of the moisture is returned through evaporation and transpiration through leaves to the moving air mass. So it literally recycles the water, which started at the tropical Atlantic, several times before it gets to the high wall of the Andes. And then, of course, the air mass has to move up. And as it does that, it cools. And a lot of that water is dropped out and becomes the 20% of the river water, which is the Amazon River system. So the amount of deforestation that has gone on when combined with the extensive use of fire and climate change is actually bringing that system close to a tipping point. And it's probably already in tipping mode, but it takes a while. But what will happen if we don't build back the margin of safety through some reforestation is there will be insufficient rain in the southern and eastern Amazon to support a rainforest. Mm. And the forest will begin to convert to savanna. And there will be less rainfall going to central Brazil and further south. So that amazing hydrological cycle, which makes the rainforest itself possible, but is also made possible by the rainforest, benefits every country in South America except for Chile. The Andes are just too high for the moisture to get over it, but every other country benefits. So we're at a point where we actually need to manage the Amazon as a system and do some very proactive reforestation to build back a margin of safety.
And how do we, obviously, if money was no option, and this COVID thing gets out of the way, how do we do that in over 2 million square miles? I mean, where do you start? It's just,
Well, there are huge chunks of it which you don't have to worry about too much because they're too far away.
okay.
Uh, but it's mostly a matter of creating incentives and disincentives and having proper enforcement against illegal deforestation, for example, and then promoting sustainable use of the rest of it. And there are plenty of things that could be done which have yet to be brought to scale.
Okay.
So that river system includes some incredible fish. There are catfish which have life cycles which go from basically from the estuary to the Andes and back in their life cycles. So basically they cross the continent in their life cycle. And then there are others which are much more local and absolutely delicious, and which are actually quite good for raising in aquaculture. So there are efforts at aquaculture here and there throughout the Amazon. It has never been brought to scale. It clearly could be brought to scale. And I can envision a time when those fish, like the tambaqui in Brazil, which feeds on palm nuts, will be as known worldwide as salmon or cod. It's one of those opportunities just waiting there for somebody to do something about it.
Obviously, before the show we talked, and you're not in Brazil right now, but any new initiatives that you have on the drawing board, whether per the Amazon Biodiversity Center, the UN Foundation, per your work at George Mason University, that you can talk about connected to all this?
Sure. So one of the big challenges for the Amazon is actually dealing with 8 different countries.
Okay.
And if you're going to manage the Amazon as a system, all those countries need to be involved. And I would say we're still a fair distance from that kind of joint awareness and collaboration. But there's no reason there can't be steps in that direction. It's just a matter of putting the incentives in the right place.
Well, I hope that we get out of this. I know it's been tough in Brazil, but through this pandemic sooner than not, so you can get back and continue with these efforts. I mean, it's been an amazing several decades for you, and really wishing you the best with all of this moving forward and continuing your journey on this extremely important issue for all of us. For everybody that is going to be listening to this particular episode on the podcast or watching on the YouTube channel, you've been listening to Dr. Thomas Lovejoy, founder and president of the Amazon Biodiversity Center, professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at George Mason University, and senior fellow at the United Nations Foundation in Washington. Dr. Lovejoy, I appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to come talk to us for a little while about everything going on, and really thanking you for the last several decades of you doing this. As we say, thank you for helping to create a better tomorrow via this initiatives. Any final messages you want for the audience, please, you can have the floor.
So, would encourage everybody just to learn more about the Amazon, and therefore what kinds of things they might be able to do individually to help. And to those for whom it's practical, once the COVID has basically been tamed, actually go visit it yourself. It's a quite extraordinary place, and your first reaction will be, I'm not seeing a lot of animals. All I'm seeing is a lot of green. And then you begin to look a little more closely. You begin to see the insects and the butterflies, and then you hear the birds. You will have not seen such biological richness in your entire life.
Hopefully one day we can get back there, and hopefully soon.
Absolutely.
Really great talking to you. Thanks so much
Great.
for coming on the show.
Thank you.